Second key principle of dealing with low back pain is you want to try to avoid falling into the diagnosis trap. This is true for any injury in the body, whether it's a shoulder, elbow, neck, any knee issue, anything that's going on in you. We have a tendency to get really over-reliant on this name that we call these symptoms, this diagnosis, but it really very often does little to tell you how to treat it or why it occurred in the first place. A lot of times it's really just putting a fancy name on something that you're already describing. One of the best examples of this is, especially when it comes to low back pain, would be like a piriformis syndrome. Now, it's not hard to get a diagnosis of piriformis syndrome if you have pain in that pelvic area and you have a lot of tightness going from your pelvis out to your hip. And especially if you have a little bit of like sciatic or radiating pain down the thigh. However, getting the diagnosis of piriformis syndrome it's not that beneficial in the treatment process, because it has done very little to tell you, like, well, why was that piriformis tight in the first place? Do we actually really know what's piriformis syndrome? There could be other things that are going on in that area that can cause that pain. So you don't want to get too hung up on your diagnosis. Another big reason for not getting too hung up on the diagnosis is when you're looking at this area, and the lumbar spine would be right here, nothing happens in this area in a vacuum. You can't have piriformis syndrome without hip involvement. You can't have low back pain without addressing where the pelvis is oriented in space. None of these things work in isolation. So why you have pain somewhere is not necessarily that relevant unless you look at the whole structure. And one of the big problems with being too reliant on the diagnosis is we'll focusing too narrow-mindedly or too myopically at one area, as opposed to addressing how well the system is working as a whole. And in truth, you can't even look at just this system as a whole. You actually have to look at this system in context to everything else, whether it's how the pelvic diaphragm relates to the thoracic diaphragm, or how well your foot is operating, or how stable your foot, shin and hip are on the ground. Like, all that stuff will affect your low back pain. So just a key tip would be, don't get too hung up on that diagnosis and worry more about the process on how you can distribute force correctly and improve your body's ability to endure force. Those are probably the two biggest things that occur in low back pain.